It was an ordinary afternoon, and everything seemed perfectly normal in the house. The air was calm, and the quiet hum of the room was interrupted only by the soft laughter between them. She and her boyfriend were in her room, talking about everything and nothing. It felt like one of those peaceful moments where time stood still, just two people enjoying each other's company. But then, the silence was shattered. The door creaked open, and there she was, her sister, standing in the doorway. She froze, her eyes scanning the scene. It was a brief moment, but in that instant, everything changed. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. Her boyfriend was the first to react. He sprang up from the bed, his face turning crimson as he stammered, trying to make sense of the situation. The awkwardness was almost suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, unsure of what to do or say. The unexpected visitor wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. Not like this. Her sister remained silent, her eyes fixed on them. There was no judgment in her gaze, but the weight of her stare was more than enough. It was as though she already knew more than she should. The room felt smaller by the second, and the tension in the air made it hard to breathe. Her sister didn't move. She just stood there, absorbing the moment. And in the midst of the confusion, a small, uneasy part of her began to wonder, was this really happening? The room was still, too still. Her sister remained standing in the doorway, her eyes locked on the couple. Neither moved, as if frozen by the gravity of the situation. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. It felt as though time had stopped, and the world outside the room had faded away. Her boyfriend was the first to break the stillness, his voice barely audible as he tried to explain. But his words came out wrong, stumbling over each other, twisting into a mess of confusion. He glanced at her, unsure of what to say, and then at her sister, who hadn't moved an inch. His discomfort was palpable, his face flushed with embarrassment. Her sister raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, it felt like the world had tilted off its axis. That stare, sharp, unwavering, made her stomach tighten. It wasn't judgment, but something deeper, something that cut right to the core. It was as if her sister had already figured out the story and was waiting for them to catch up. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. It was as though the walls were closing in, pushing them into a corner where there was no escape. Her thoughts raced, but the words she wanted to say just wouldn't come. She wanted to break the tension, to make it go away, but nothing felt right. Her boyfriend shifted uncomfortably, his hands fiddling with the edge of his shirt. His nervousness only made the moment more unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity as they all stood there, stuck in the weight of the silence. Her sister's gaze remained fixed, unblinking, as though she were reading them like an open book, seeing things they hadn't even realized were there. In that moment, everything felt uncertain, and it became clear that whatever happened next would change things forever. The tension was almost unbearable as her sister finally broke the silence, but not in the way anyone had expected. Her voice was calm, almost amused, as she spoke. She didn't seem shocked, didn't seem to care about what she had just walked in on. Instead, she simply raised an eyebrow and casually said, "I didn't know you two were serious." Her words hung in the air, completely unexpected, and they both stared at her, unsure of what to make of it. There was no judgment in her tone, no harshness, but something about her casual delivery made the situation even more uncomfortable. She spoke as though it was just another normal conversation, one that didn't involve the kind of moment they were caught in. The room felt even more awkward now, the space between them charged with the weight of what had just been said. Her sister, still unbothered, took a few steps forward and stepped into the room. She casually sat on the bed, as though nothing had changed, and the dynamic between them shifted again. The casualness of her actions made it all the more difficult to figure out what was going on. Her boyfriend was still standing, clearly unsure of what to do next. His face remained flushed, and he exchanged glances with her, both of them unsure how to react. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his hands shoved into his pockets, unable to meet anyone's gaze for long. The conversation continued in a halting, awkward fashion, as her sister seemed to act as if she was merely a bystander to a regular, everyday conversation. She had no qualms about the situation, as if it didn't faze her in the slightest. But the more she spoke, the more a sense of unease settled in, like something was lurking beneath the surface, something that neither of them was ready for. The awkward conversation continued, but the sense of unease grew stronger with each passing moment. As they tried to navigate through the unexpected situation, her sister dropped a bombshell that no one had seen coming. It was casual, as if she were revealing something trivial, but the weight of her words hit them both like a freight train. "I've known about you two for a while," her sister said, her tone almost nonchalant. "Way longer than you probably realized." Her heart skipped a beat as she processed the revelation. She had thought their relationship was a secret, something hidden from everyone, something only they shared. But now, her sister's words shattered that illusion, making her question everything she had believed. Her boyfriend stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. He looked at her sister, as though trying to gauge how much she really knew. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization was sinking in for him too. How long had her sister known? What else had she been aware of? It was as though the ground beneath them had shifted, and the solid foundation of trust they thought they had was crumbling before their eyes. The room was still, filled with the heavy silence of her sister's words hanging in the air. Her stomach twisted with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. How had she managed to keep the secret from them? Had she been watching, waiting for the right moment to say something? Or had she known all along, letting them live in their bubble of deception? Her boyfriend shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the turn the conversation had taken. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. The weight of the revelation was too much for either of them to process immediately, and the tension between them deepened. The truth, once hidden, now lay bare in front of them, and neither of them knew how to deal with it. The room seemed to grow colder with every word that passed between them. Her sister, now sitting comfortably on the bed, had an almost mischievous gleam in her eye. Her tone was light, but there was something about it that sent an uneasy chill through the air. She leaned back, her gaze flickering between her and her boyfriend, as if savoring the moment. "You didn't think I'd figure it out, did you?" Her sister teased, her voice laced with a hint of mockery. There was something in the way she said it that made her feel small, exposed, like all her secrets were suddenly on display. Her boyfriend shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his eyes avoiding both of them. It was clear that he was trying to hide the unease that had crept into him. His past with her sister, a part of their shared history, wasn't as simple as either of them had believed. The weight of their previous interactions began to resurface, and she could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken tension growing thicker by the second. A nagging suspicion began to form in her mind. Had they crossed some line in the past? Was there more to their relationship than either of them had let on? The thought twisted uncomfortably in her gut. She had known about their history, but now, with her sister's cryptic words and teasing tone, she began to wonder if there was more that had been kept hidden. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation, but every possible explanation seemed worse than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that things had been much more complicated than she had ever realized. The idea of her sister and boyfriend being involved in something deeper, something she didn't know about, was unbearable. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She could feel the weight of her suspicions bearing down on her, even though she wasn't sure if they were true or if she was simply allowing her mind to wander. Either way, she knew that she couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt that was taking root. Her boyfriend, still silent, shifted again, his discomfort evident. She could tell that he was avoiding something, but what? The truth was slipping through the cracks, and the more she tried to grasp it, the more elusive it became. The air between them had thickened, the weight of their unspoken thoughts becoming almost unbearable. The tension was no longer just in the room, it was inside her, swirling around her chest like a storm. She could feel her pulse quickening as the questions she had been avoiding finally bubbled to the surface. With her heart hammering in her chest, she turned to her sister, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "Have you two ever been together?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, her stomach twisting as she waited for an answer. Her sister's response came in the form of a sharp, chilling laugh. It wasn't the laughter of someone amused, it was colder, more knowing. Her gaze, though, never left her boyfriend. Her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made the air seem heavier, as if she were waiting for him to speak, to break the silence. Her boyfriend hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, anywhere but at either of them. He was trying to avoid the question, trying to find some way out, but it was clear that there was no easy escape this time. The truth was closing in on them, suffocating them with every passing second. The longer he stayed silent, the more her suspicions grew. The way he shifted uncomfortably, the way his eyes avoided hers, it was enough to make her stomach drop. Something was wrong. She could feel it, deep in her gut. The truth was slipping through their fingers, but the closer they got to it, the harder it seemed to be to confront. Her sister, watching the unfolding scene with a quiet smirk, didn't give her boyfriend a chance to avoid the question. She knew, and it was clear that the game had already begun. Her silence was louder than any words could have been. Her brother-in-law's discomfort was evident, and the strain was clear in every shift of his gaze. Her stomach twisted with the implications of everything that had been left unsaid. Each moment stretched on, and with every passing second, the suspicion that had lingered grew stronger. Had they been involved before? Had they crossed lines she wasn't aware of? She needed to know. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavier than ever before. Her mind raced with questions, but none of the answers seemed to satisfy her growing unease. Her boyfriend, who had remained quiet up until now, finally spoke, but his voice was tight, strained. "It's not what you think," he said, but the words did little to calm her racing heart. The more he tried to explain, the more she realized how little she truly understood about what was happening. Her sister's casual demeanor only made things worse. She sat back on the bed, unfazed, her gaze flickering between them as if she were simply watching a drama unfold before her eyes. There was no surprise in her eyes, no reaction to the tension that was gripping the room. It was as if this had all been a foregone conclusion. Her boyfriend's words barely made it past his lips as she processed what was happening. Each sentence felt like it was just a feeble attempt to cover up the cracks that were quickly growing wider between them. She felt betrayed, not just by the situation, but by the fact that she had trusted him without realizing how much had been kept from her. Her sister, however, didn't seem to mind the unfolding chaos. She was almost detached, too calm for the moment. As if she had been waiting for this, anticipating it, and now she was simply observing the fallout. Her nonchalance only deepened the sense of betrayal that was gnawing at her. It was as though her sister had always been the one to know everything, always the one in control of the situation, while she had been kept in the dark. Her boyfriend, still trying to salvage the situation, looked at her with desperate eyes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden from her. The more he spoke, the more distant she felt, as though they were no longer on the same page, as though he was speaking a language she didn't understand anymore. Her sister, with a small, knowing smile, shifted her weight on the bed, looking at them like two players in a game she already knew the outcome of. The secrets were spilling out, layer by layer, and she couldn't stop them. The revelations were coming faster than she could process, and with each one, she felt more and more like she was losing control of the situation. The truth was unraveling, but the more they tried to fix it, the more it seemed to slip away. Just when she thought things couldn't get any more complicated, her sister leaned forward, breaking the growing tension with an unexpected statement. "I only told you because it's time you knew the truth," she said, her eyes locked onto her, the intensity of her gaze impossible to ignore. Her words, though calm, carried a deeper meaning, a weight that hit her harder than she had expected. She felt the ground shift beneath her as she tried to process what her sister was saying. "I've been covering for him, covering for you both, For far too long, her sister added, her voice steady but laced with a strange undercurrent of finality. The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. The idea that her sister had known all this time, had been aware of their secret relationship, and had kept it from her, it was overwhelming. The realization that her sister wasn't just an observer, but an active participant in keeping things hidden left her feeling exposed. She had trusted her sister, but now that trust felt like a distant memory. Her boyfriend stood there, still silent, his eyes flickering between her and her sister. His confusion was palpable, but there was something else in his expression, a quiet understanding, as if he too was beginning to realize the extent of what had been hidden from him. His eyes betrayed his thoughts, as if the pieces were slowly falling into place, and the truth of it all was settling on him as heavily as it was on her. Her sister's demeanor remained unchanged, as though she had been prepared for this moment all along. There was no guilt, no apology in her eyes. It was as if she had always known this day would come, and now that it had arrived, she was simply letting the truth out. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, she was just revealing the facts, one layer at a time. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of her sister's words sunk in. She had been so sure of what she knew, so certain that everything had been hidden. But now, the truth was spiraling out of control. And in that moment, she realized that the secrets, the lies, and the manipulation had all been part of a much bigger game, one that she had only just begun to understand. The truth was finally out, but she wasn't sure if she could ever piece together the shattered parts of her trust again. The atmosphere in the room had shifted once again, but this time, it was different. There was no longer an attempt to hide behind explanations or half-formed truths. Her sister had taken control of the situation, and it was clear that the dynamics between them had changed forever. She sat back on the bed, her posture relaxed, as if the power had already shifted in her favor. "You can't hide from the truth anymore," her sister said, her voice steady and unyielding. The words seemed to hang in the air, more like a statement of fact than a command. It was as if she had known all along that this moment would come, that the truth would eventually surface, and now that it had, there was no turning back. Her boyfriend shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden change in the room's energy. He looked from one to the other, unsure of how to react. His usual confidence had faltered, replaced by a nervous tension that was hard to ignore. It was clear that he didn't know whether to stand his ground or retreat into silence, but either way, it was no longer entirely in his hands. The power was with her sister, and it felt like the whole situation had been turned upside down. She looked at her boyfriend, her mind racing. The weight of what was happening settled on her, heavy and suffocating. What had started as a simple confrontation had turned into something much more complex. The balance of power had shifted, and she was no longer sure who was in control of the narrative. Her sister, calm and collected, seemed to have every move planned, while she and her boyfriend were left scrambling to catch up. Her sister's words lingered in the air, ringing in her ears. It wasn't just about the secret they had kept, it was about something much bigger, something her sister had always known and used to her advantage. She was no longer just the observer. She had become the player, the one pulling the strings. And as the situation unfolded, it became clear that her sister wasn't just revealing the truth, she was in complete control of how it would all play out. The room was charged with a sense of power that was almost palpable. Her sister was no longer the bystander, the one watching from the sidelines. She was the one making the rules now, and it was up to them to decide how they would react. Every move felt like it was being orchestrated, like they were all part of a much larger game that they hadn't been aware of. She could feel the shift in the room, the change in the air, but she wasn't sure where it would take them. Would they be able to regain control, or had her sister already sealed their fate? The power play had begun, and she was left to wonder just how far it would go. The truth had been revealed, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far more complicated, something neither of them had been prepared for. The room, once filled with quiet conversation, was now thick with the aftermath of what had just transpired. Every word, Every glance between them felt heavy, loaded with the weight of secrets laid bare. Her boyfriend stood still, his face a mask of uncertainty, his eyes flickering from her to her sister, trying to read the situation, but failing to find a way to fix the broken pieces of what was left. The air between them felt like an impenetrable wall, and no amount of explanation seemed enough to break it down. The trust they had shared was fragile, and now it seemed irreparably shattered. What had once felt like a bond between them now felt distant, strained by the invisible fractures that had been exposed. Her sister, on the other hand, sat back on the bed, looking more like an observer than an active participant. She seemed unfazed, unaffected by the tension in the room, almost as though she had already predicted this outcome. Her calm demeanor only made the situation worse, making it feel as though she had always known how things would unfold and had simply been waiting for the moment to come. For her, the weight of betrayal was unbearable. It wasn't just the secrecy of the relationship, it was the realization that her sister had known all along and had been complicit in keeping it hidden. She had trusted her sister, believed in their bond, but now it felt like a lie. The foundation of her family had cracked, and she didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. Her boyfriend glanced at her, his eyes searching for some kind of resolution, but there was none. He seemed to understand that the moment had passed, and there was no going back. What had been a quiet, private relationship between the two of them had now become a tangled web of lies, misunderstandings, and betrayal. The fallout wasn't just between her and her sister, it was between her and him as well. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional shift in posture, the sound of someone clearing their throat. It was as if they were all waiting for the next move, but no one knew what to do. The tension was suffocating, and the future seemed uncertain. Would she be able to salvage her relationship with her boyfriend? Would her bond with her sister ever be the same again? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the fallout from the confrontation continued to unfold. In the end, the weight of the truth had done its damage. It had shattered the peace they once had, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. The damage was done, and the fallout had only just begun. What came next was anyone's guess. A week had passed since the confrontation, but the silence between them was just as loud as the chaos that had unfolded. The house, once filled with the hum of everyday life, now felt eerily quiet, as if something fundamental had been broken and couldn't be fixed. The tension still lingered in the air, hanging over every room like an invisible cloud that refused to dissipate. Her sister and she had barely spoken since that day. There had been no confrontation, no resolution, just the cold, awkward distance that had settled between them. Her sister, who had always been a constant in her life, now felt like a stranger. The trust that had once been so easily shared was now an unreachable thing, locked away behind walls that neither of them seemed willing to break down. Her relationship with her boyfriend was no better. They had tried to rebuild, but the cracks in their connection were too deep to simply gloss over. Every conversation felt forced, every touch uncertain, as though neither of them knew where to place the pieces of their relationship after everything that had happened. The trust they had once shared seemed to be fading, slipping away with every passing day. She couldn't help but wonder if they could ever truly return to the way things had been, or if the damage had been too great to repair. The weight of the truth had opened doors that couldn't be closed again. She had seen sides of her sister, and even her boyfriend, that she hadn't been aware of before. The lies, the secrets, and the manipulation were now impossible to ignore. And while they had been exposed, it didn't mean the wounds would heal easily. She couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. The dynamic between them had shifted, and she wasn't sure if there was any way to find their way back to the way things had been before the secrets were laid bare. Every step forward felt like a struggle, as if they were all walking through the aftermath of an explosion, unsure of where the next shockwave might hit. Despite all of this, she knew she had to move forward. The truth had been revealed, and while the pain from it would take time to heal, she had to find a way to live with it. No more secrets. No more hiding. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. It was a harsh truth, but it was her reality now. And as she stood at the crossroads of her future, she realized that the only thing she could truly control was how she would face it. No more pretending, no more hiding behind illusions. It was time to accept what had happened and decide what came next.